Okay, so part 2 I'm gonna have to do at our house because I ran out of batteries in class. So I'll try to give you the overview, do it a little quicker, and hopefully it'll be just as informative as being actually in the class. So left off at Mount Sinai. All the children of Israel have come and Moses has led them there, and God has touched down on the mountain. They're all freaking out, and he's handing out the rules and the laws of the covenant that he's making with his people, saying, okay, if you want to be my people and I'm going to be your God, this is what we're going to have to do. And as you read through the Bible in the New Testament, as we're going to read, the New Testament makes it clear that these rules that God is giving, they are not going to be the people, human beings, we who would follow God, we are not going to be able to follow these rules. And we are not going to be able to be perfect and righteous, and it's just not going to work. Because, like, one of the rules is do not lie. Good luck with that. There's no way that we can do that. And that's why Jesus had to come. Another important thing that they set forth in these rules and all the rules and stuff that God gives at the end of Exodus through Leviticus, Numbers, all that stuff, it's all to point to what he's eventually going to do with Jesus. Okay? He doesn't spell that out when he's giving them, but it is made clear later in the Bible that was their purpose. Because we can't, like I already said, we can't be good enough. We can't follow those rules, so that's never going to save us. So why would God give it to us in the first place? The Bible says in the New Testament that, like, if you didn't know lying was bad before, you were just in ignorance, you're like, la, 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 lie all the time. But then God gave you the 10th commandment, do not lie, and then you're like, crap, now I know that what I'm doing is sinful. And so now I lie all the more because now I know it's bad and I like to do forbidden things like lying, stuff like that. So even though it's pointing out what we should do, it's actually just heightening our sin because we do it and because of our desire to do it. So the law is never going to save us. One thing that God does say about his laws is that if you break my laws, if you sin, you deserve to die. And you will die. Death is your punishment. The wages of sin is death. That's why before the fall of man, before Adam and Eve sinned and doomed all of humanity to this sinful way that we are, death was not a natural part of life. It's still not a natural part of life. It's an unnatural side effect and consequence of sin. They were going to live forever before sin even happened. And so when we sin, we deserve to die. The Bible makes that very clear. And so one thing that God sets forth in these rules at Mount Sinai is the process of sacrifice. Now, what they would do is they would sacrifice animals. And back in the day, you see all these different cultures making animal and even human sacrifices to their gods, okay? And the reason they do that is because it's like they're feeding their gods. They're appeasing their gods. Oh, our God's hungry. Let's sacrifice this cow or this sheep or this baby. That's what people would do, and they'd sacrifice. The kind of sacrifice God demands from his people is not the same type of sacrifice. They do sacrifice animals, but it's not to feed God. In fact, God even says in the Psalms, like, do you think I would ask you if I was hungry? Do you think I would come to you and ask you for food if I really needed it? I made all the cows in the world, okay? I can have as many of them as I want. I don't need your cows. The reason that God made the people sacrifice is because when we sin, we deserve to die. But God is a God of mercy, and he allows a substitution to take place. Okay? This is super important. Because if you sin, you deserve to die. God is allowing you to take your best animal and kill that animal in your place. You should have been killed, but instead he's allowing somebody else to take your punishment for you. Okay, that animal, that the best that you have. And back then, owning animals, big deal. That's your property. It's like owning a car. The best of those animals that you own, you go and you sacrifice to the Lord. And it's not for God's sake, it's for your sake. It's to pay for your sin. Now, all the animal sacrifices in the world can never truly pay for your sin, because the massive debt that we owe God because of our sin can never be paid through anything we can do. And that's why we needed the perfect sacrifice, a non-animal sacrifice. The perfect Son of God came and gave his life in place of us. So all the sacrifice stuff, all these rules, they're just pointing to Jesus. All the rules say you can't keep all these rules, but there's one person who can, and that's Jesus. And he's going to take your place. He's going to swap records with you on the cross. And he's going to be your substitute, the perfect substitute Lamb of God. Okay, making sense? I hope so. I tend to ramble. All right, so new children of Israel are established. So now they still haven't gotten to God's promise yet of getting that promised land. He promised Abraham, I'm going to give you this land, and all your many descendants are going to live here, and it's going to be your land. They still haven't got there. They're wandering in the desert. They got to go back to Canaan, and they got to settle in that land. Problem, while they were in slavery for 400 years, that land has been populated by other people. So all the land that God had promised them is now filled with evil, heathen kingdom people. And so how are they going to get the land back? Well, God's going to have them go in and kill everybody. Okay, now a lot of people take issue with this because they're like, God specifically tells the Israelites, go in and kill everybody and everything and show no mercy and leave no one and nothing alive. And people are like, wow, that's God, huh? Yeah, sounds like a loving God to me. Well, you got to understand something about these people living in this land. They are evil people, and they do evil practices. They're sacrificing their children to false gods. They're throwing them into the fire, and God has made it clear that he's given these people plenty of time and plenty of chances to repent and turn to him, and they have not done it. So Egypt got punished for turning against God with the plagues that God sent. These people are going to be punished with the Israelites. The Israelites are God's plague upon them to punish them for their evil. So it's not like they're going to go around and kill innocent people. It's these people had their chance. They were warned. They didn't follow through, so here comes the hammer, okay? But before any of that can happen, they've got to get there. So they go up to the edge of Canaan, and they send in their spies. And a couple of spies come back and say, oh, this land is everything God promised. It's awesome. They got grapes as big as people. I mean, like grape clusters as big as people. It's awesome. It's going to be the best land ever. And then the rest of the spies are like, we have to turn around and run away right now because this land is full of giants and really tough-looking people, and they're going to kill us all. And we just need to turn around and go back to Egypt because we were better off there with them instead of here with a God who's just going to send us to our dooms. And the other guys were like, no, God's with us. We can't lose. But all the people listened to the naysayers. And so they chickened out and they ran away and they would not go in. And so God's like, all right, fine. All you people are not going to go see my promised land. Your children will, but because you have not trusted in me, you're going to wander in the desert until you all die, and then your kids can go in. Now, this is all super important stuff. It's the history of Israel. These are the founding fathers again. And Jesus is going to be referencing stuff like this as we read his story. So they wander for 40 years in the desert, and everybody who was part of that original generation dies off except for two guys, the two spies who were faithful. They get to go in and see the promised land. And one of those spies was it Joshua? Was Joshua one of those spies? I think so.
Joshua and Caleb.
I think so. Okay, let's go with that. Anyway, Joshua is Moses' assistant. He's like his second in command. And so when Moses dies before they get to go into the promised land. So when Moses dies, Joshua is now in charge. And they're going to go in there and they're going to take the promised land. And I don't know if you guys know the story of Joshua in the Battle of Jericho. Sarah didn't know it, so I told it to her. But it's just a really sweet story. You should read it. It's like in the first couple of chapters of the book of Joshua. But it's not necessarily important for what we're talking about here, but it's super cool. Anyway, Joshua leads the people in there. They follow God, they obey him, and they conquer the land and drive out or kill all of the evil Canaanite people who live there. Oh yeah, it is important. Let me tell you the story really quick. So they go in there, and there's Jericho, which is the main city, and or the first city that they come to that's in their way, and it's got a giant wall around it. And Joshua and all the Israelites are like, "How are we going to get in there? How are we going to bust down that wall? We don't have, catapults. We don't have trebuchets. All we got is guys and swords and sticks and cows and stuff. How are we going to take this city?" So God appears to Joshua, and he says, "Hey, how you doing? Follow my instructions and I will give you the city." So he tells them to walk around the city once a day for 7 days and don't do anything else, and then go back. And so, what are the people in this city thinking? Like, well, these guys are weird. They're not even attacking. They're just walking around in circles. And on the last day, he says, walk around the city 7 times and blow all your trumpets and yell really loud. And they do that, and when they do that, God breaks down the walls. Like, all the walls around the city just crumble and fall. And then all the guys inside the city poop themselves. The Bible doesn't say that, but I imagine that's what happened. And all the Israelites came in there and were slashing and killing everybody, and there's only one family that got to live through the Jericho thing, and that is Rahab and her family. And the reason she got to live is because when they sent some spies in to check out the city beforehand, and when they went in, Rahab was the only person who offered them shelter, and she hid them from the guards of the city. And she said, "Okay, if I hide you, will you spare my family?" And they said, "Yes, we will do that." And Rahab was a prostitute, but she was the only person who took them in and hid them and saved them, because she knew, she says it in the Bible, everybody else is terrified because we know that God is with you. We heard about what God did to Egypt. And so I'm siding with you and your God. And so she hid those guys, and they let her live, and she became the great grandmother of Jesus Christ on the earth. Just a cool picture of how God can use anybody, even a prostitute. All right, so after that, after they settle in the land, they split up into all their different tribes. So, like we said, all the sons of Jacob are named different tribes. Like, so he had Judah, Reuben, Benjamin. They're all different tribes. The tribe of Judah, tribe of Benjamin, blah, 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 blah. Jesus is from the tribe of Judah. That's where his family is from. But anyway, they all settle there. So they're like states, okay? So there's like 12 or 13 different states here. But they're not the United States. They're not united. They're all separate, and they do their own thing. And the only time they ever come together is when people come and attack them. And then they get into this kind of cycle. Okay, we call this the time of the judges. After the book of Joshua, we have the judges. Judges are leaders that God rose up for the nation to lead them in times of trouble. There was no king, there was no president, there was no mayor. Everybody's doing their own thing. But then when trouble comes, God raises up a judge, gives him the power of the Holy Spirit, and God uses that judge to free the people of Israel. Because they get in this cycle. The cycle goes like this. Starts up here, they're following God, everything's good. Goes around here. Now, things are so good, we forget about God, and we just start taking everything for granted and doing our own thing, and we sin, and we turn against God. Maybe not knowingly, but by the things we're doing, we're turning against God because we're not doing what he said, and we're doing the opposite of what he said. And so now we're full of sin and all this stuff, and we're not turning away from it. And so because of that, we come down here to where God sends judgment on the nation because they are not doing what he said. So he allows an invading army to come in and conquer the land, and the people get oppressed by an evil king or something like that. And then once they're doing that, they become oppressed, and they say, oh, they turn back to God. God, help us. We're oppressed. We will turn back to you if you would only help us. God listens to their cries. He raises up a judge. The judge comes, and through the power of God, the judge frees the nation from the evil oppression, and then they go back to honoring God and being happy, and then we start it all over again. And this goes on for like a while. There's several judges. It goes on for a couple hundred years. Some of the judges' stories are cool. Like if you heard of Samson, he was a judge. God raised him up. He was a regular guy, but God gave him massive superhuman strength, and he could do things that normal people couldn't do. There was another judge who was like a cool ninja stealth guy, and he snuck into the palace and assassinated the evil king, like Assassin's Creed style. It's really cool. You should read it. They made a movie about the Book of Judges. It'd be rated R for violence and awesomeness. All right. So after this happens, the last judge is Samuel. And the people come to Samuel and they say, Samuel, not that you're not doing a great job, but we don't want judges anymore. We want a king. Because all the other nations around us, they've got a king. We don't. And Samuel says, are you Mashugana? Because God is your king. And he should be your only king. And they're like, no, we want a human king to lead us like all the other nations have a human king to lead them. And so Samuel's like, fine. And God reassures Samuel, don't worry, they're not turning against you, they're turning against me. And listen to them, you should give them a king. I'm going to give them a king, and they're not going to like it because the king's going to take all their people. He's going to take their land for his castle. He's going to enlist their men in the army, and they think they know what they want, but they don't because I'm God and I know what's best, but they're not listening to me. So first king gets raised up. He's kind of a dud, King Saul. He kind of is a good king for a little bit, but then he kind of turns crazy and starts trying to kill everybody. And then, well, maybe not everybody, but he tries to kill the next king, and he's throwing spears at people, and it's not good. The next king that gets raised up after him is King David. And this guy is super important. Have you ever heard of David and Goliath? Same guy. He is the quintessential king of Israel. He's like the poster boy. He's like, if you're like, oh, give me an example of a superhero, the go-to is either like Superman or Batman, right? They're just like the quintessential superhero. If you say, give me an example of what a king of Israel should look like, King David. He's the example we want, okay? And that's important. He's a man after God's own heart. He does all this heroic stuff. And because the Messiah eventually will be called, he's going to be a king like David. When people were looking for the Messiah, they're saying, oh, we want the Messiah because he's going to be like David. And he's going to come and rescue us from our enemies. And he's going to save us. So he's a pretty important figure in the Bible. Working on my train of thought here. Okay. So after David dies, he has Solomon, and Solomon was considered the wisest man on earth because God came to him and said, Solomon, hey, you are the son of King David, and you're going to be the king of Israel. What do you want? Tell me something that you want, I will give it to you. So that's like God giving you a blank check. Tell me anything you want, I will give it to you. And Solomon says, I just want wisdom. Help me have wisdom. And God says, you got it. And because you could have asked me for anything. You could have asked me for gold, riches, power, but you asked me for wisdom. And because you asked me for wisdom, I'm going to give you all that other stuff anyway. So he is considered the wisest man who's ever lived besides Jesus. It's important because Jesus is going to reference that. And even though he's got all this wisdom, though, he doesn't follow it. He starts going crazy, and he starts worshiping false gods, and he marries 700 wives and 300 concubines. And then they lead him astray, and he starts following other gods. And after him, the rest of the kings that raise up, they're pretty much all bad. Like, all the other kings, with a few exceptions, are all pretty much duds, and they are leading the people astray. They're doing their own thing. They're selfish. They're cruel. They are worshiping false gods. And so then God starts raising up another class of people called the prophets. Okay, so at this time you have kings and then you have prophets. And prophets come and God sends them and they tell the king, hey, you're doing this wrong. This is what God says to do. Stop doing that. Start doing this, or this is going to happen. Something bad's going to happen. And he sends prophets. And that's where we get the pictures of like big bearded guys with like staffs and yelling out in the streets. Those were the prophets. God told them to do that. They would go and they'd yell in the streets and they would do crazy performance art to show the people what God wanted them to do, and God would tell them to do all that. And they also foretold the future. because God would show them visions of the future. They would write it down. They would tell the future of what's going to happen to Israel, and then they would tell the future of what's going to happen around the world. And all of their predictions came true. There's some that are about the end of the world that haven't come true yet, but everything that they predicted about the ancient world, like which armies would rise up, they predicted the rise of Greece, they predicted the rise of Rome, hundreds and hundreds of years before it actually happened. That's how we know the Bible is legit, and it's not just a bunch of fake rambling stuff some guy made up in a bar. It is true, and it is verifiably true by history in what it says. So then they also prophesy about the Messiah. They say God is sending somebody to fix it, not put a Band-Aid on it, but cure the problem of sin in the world. Because throughout the Bible, they kind of get away from that. They're like, okay, they start worrying about politics. They start worrying about the do this and don't do that, the do this and the don't do that. And they kind of forget that it's not about a list of rules and regulations. It's about a relationship with God. And that relationship has been fractured and broken by sin. But God is going to send somebody who's going to restore everything and fix everything. And that person is going to be the Messiah. And all the Messiah stuff, they don't know what it's pointing to. But looking back now that we have the New Testament, it clearly and definitively all points to Jesus. So we're going to be reading that, and they're going to be referencing those prophecies from those prophets when they're talking about Jesus in John, the book that we're going to be reading. Okay, so after all the prophets come, then God keeps telling the kings through the prophets, if you don't shape up, I'm going to destroy Israel, and I am going to send you all away because you are not following me. They don't believe that is going to happen. If you read it, it is scary. It is a scary thing because it's just like the United States current predicament. That's another lesson for another time. And they don't believe him, and they keep doing what they want to do. And finally, God does send the Babylonian Empire to destroy Israel and they exile everybody over to Babylon. So they take all of Israel away, except for a couple people, and then they put them all over in Babylon. And they're over in Babylon for, I think it's like 70 years or something. And that's where you have the stories of like Daniel in the lion's den, and the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. That's all over in Babylon during the exile. Eventually, God, and there's a bunch of prophets that prophesy over there, and they talk about the restoration of Israel, and eventually God does bring the people back, and they rebuild the temple, and they have a revival, and they all turn back to God. So after this final big, giant, massive exile and the final destruction of their entire nation, the people finally get it. They stop turning away from God, they stop worshiping idols, and they become solid and resolutely devoted to the Lord. They're no longer wishy-washy. They are in it to win it. And so people will come and they'll try to make them bow down to other gods, and they just will not do it because they know we disobeyed God before. Our ancestors disobeyed God before. We are not doing that again. We are following God, period, which is awesome. So they come back and they make all those resolutions, and they give their lives to the Lord. They have revival, and then God stops talking. Last book of the Old Testament is Malachi, and that is the end. God doesn't speak to any more prophets. God doesn't say anything from heaven. He just stops talking for 400 years. And then that silence is suddenly broken when the Messiah finally comes. And people are just waiting for the Messiah to come, and finally he does come. And we're going to pick it up where we leave off right here with the story of Jesus in John. Before we do that, I just want to give you one more history thing to get you up to speed about where we're at in the world when Jesus finally comes, when we're going to start reading in the book of John. After the Israelites came back to where they were still under the rule of, so when they were in Babylon got conquered by the Persian Empire, which if you've ever seen the movie like 300, same Persian Empire that was attacking Greece, that they attacked Babylon, took it over, and they let the Israelites go back to where they were from. And that's when during that time is when we start calling the Israelites Jews. So they let the Jews go back to their homeland, and then the Persian Empire finally gets conquered by Greece, a guy named Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great conquers everything, and he tries to make the Israelites bow down, or not him, but the ruler after him tries to make the Israelites bow down and worship Greek gods. They won't do it. They stage a rebellion. They overthrow Greece, and they rule for a little bit. But then, lo and behold, the Romans, they rise up. They take over Greece. They retake over Israel. And that is who is currently ruling Israel when we come to Jesus' time. The Israelites do not rule themselves. They are under Roman authority. So you have two different types of authority kind of going on when we come to Jesus' story. The Romans, they're the governmental authority. They're in charge of the state, the army, all that stuff. But then you have the religious leaders, and Rome was kind of cool to the Jews, because Rome allowed them to continue to worship and do their own religion as long as it didn't get in the way of the Roman government. And so they had a really tense relationship, because the Jewish customs are all like, no, it needs to be this way, and the Roman customs are like, no, it needs to be this way, and they're always kind of button heads. And so in the middle of this intense relationship between the Jews and the Romans, Jesus shows up, and he just starts flipping the tables on everything and says, okay, these are the rules that you think that there are, or no. This is how the rules actually go. This is what God actually says. This is how you actually should live. And this is what I'm actually saying. And everybody starts freaking out for one reason or another. So that's where we're at. We're going to pick it up in John. So hope this was helpful.